talking about here on my channel right now. It's all about Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively's.
Hi besties, I am with Bashan Lashari with Corevanta. Today we should discuss about the
Blake Lively exposed. Bryan Freedman drops new bombshell that could change everything. The scandal engulfing Hollywood's once celebrated sweetheart Blake Lively has reached explosive new heights after powerhouse attorney Bryan Freedman, known for tearing down industry giants with surgical precision, allegedly dropped a new bombshell that insiders claim could alter the trajectory of her career, and even ignite speculation about legal consequences that Blake never imagined facing. And as the dust from the earlier, "It's over" phase had barely begun to settle, this latest update has fans, critics, and entertainment reporters scrambling to decode whether Lively's carefully curated image of perfect marriages, flawless fashion, and best friend alliances with figures like Taylor Swift has finally begun to crumble under the crushing weight of courtroom strategies, leaked whispers, and brutal public perception wars. And what makes this chapter even more alarming for Blake is not just Freedman's razor-sharp reputation, but the fact that his interventions usually signify that the tide of truth is turning against the opposition, as seen in previous high-profile battles where Hollywood elites underestimated the ruthlessness of legal maneuvering until it was far too late. And here, the narrative spirals around how Bryan Freedman has now intensified his pursuit, dropping a fresh set of revelations and legal interpretations that frame Blake not as the innocent victim of celebrity rivalries, but as a potential manipulator, someone who might have twisted the machinery of fame, influence, and friendships for personal gain. A portrayal that completely undercuts the persona she has spent years cultivating through red carpets, witty Instagram captions, and playful trolling exchanges with husband Ryan Reynolds. And when examining the timeline, it becomes clear that the earlier phases of this scandal, where questions about false narratives, misleading headlines, and courtroom victories painted in misleading light dominated the discourse, were merely the prelude to this much darker revelation where Freedman reportedly exposed contradictions between Blake's public-facing claims and private maneuvers, stirring whispers about credibility gaps that could carry severe consequences if interpreted legally. And this is where the jail angle, however speculative, begins to loom over the conversation, because Hollywood knows that while most celebrity scandals fizzle out as gossip, once attorneys like Freedman start introducing the possibility of perjury, intentional misrepresentation, or obstruction of justice into the discussion, suddenly the stakes are no longer about PR control, but about survival in the harsh spotlight of the law. And Blake's critics argue that this new chapter isn't simply about whether she loses influence in her social circle, or whether her marriage with Ryan Reynolds comes under further strain, but about whether she can withstand a storm designed to peel away every layer of performance and reveal a calculated operator beneath the surface. While her defenders push back by insisting that Freedman's bombshells, while powerful, are still strategically timed narratives meant to weaken her resolve and paint her as vulnerable. Yet the undeniable fact is that the public, once spellbound by Blake's charm, is now consuming these stories with a mixture of fascination and suspicion, noticing how even her silence has grown louder as each headline mounts. And if we dive deeper into the mechanics of this legal and PR showdown, one cannot ignore the symbolic betrayal that seemed to kick off this entire downward spiral, when Taylor Swift, her once unquestionable ally, sidelined Blake from wedding plans, a gesture that sent ripples through fandoms and Hollywood circles alike, suggesting that the bonds between these stars were far more transactional than heartfelt. And suddenly the narrative shifted from Blake the friend to Blake the outcast, a theme that this new Freedman bombshell has reignited by portraying her as someone who not only lost allies but may have knowingly compromised her position by pushing distorted truths. And Hollywood thrives on perception. One moment you are America's sweetheart, the next you are the cautionary tale whispered at after parties. And in this context, Freedman's revelations don't just expose alleged inconsistencies, but threaten to reframe Blake's entire legacy, pulling Ryan Reynolds into the crossfire as the world speculates whether his recent solo appearances at TIFF and his deliberate distancing from Blake in professional contexts were signs of cracks that he saw coming long before the headlines hit. And this is where the story gains its tragic yet theatrical edge, because Hollywood isn't just watching a legal battle, it's watching the slow unraveling of a narrative meticulously crafted over a decade, one that combined the glamour of marriage, the influence of friendships, and the sharpness of wit into an image so untouchable that many believed nothing could crack it. Yet here we are, with Freedman's Bombshell shaking the very foundation of that myth. And as insiders leak whispers of documents, emails, and behind-the-scenes correspondences that allegedly contradict Blake's positions, fans are left grappling with the notion that the woman they admired for style and strength may now be seen as emblematic of Hollywood's darker game, where charm masks control, friendships are transactional, and marriages may be more fragile than Instagram jokes suggest. And when you examine how this narrative is being consumed across platforms, viral TikToks dissecting body language between Ryan and Blake, YouTube exposés flashing red bars with breaking text, and Twitter threads unpacking Freedman's every word, it becomes clear that the cultural appetite for Blake's downfall is intensifying. A dangerous shift for any celebrity, because once the tide of public sympathy recedes,
I don't think I relate to any of my characters. I've played a crack addict from Boston. I've played an Upper East Side princess.
what remains is brutal voyeurism, an audience eager to see how far someone can fall. And if Blake thought silence would protect her, this strategy is beginning to look like a liability, as critics frame her refusal to respond as evidence of guilt, while her allies' hesitation to defend her publicly amplifies the isolation narrative, and Freedman knows this, crafting each bombshell not only as a legal maneuver, but as a cultural headline designed to stick, to echo, to transform whispers into certainties. And the question hanging over Hollywood tonight is simple. If Bryan Freedman is right, if his bombshell is not merely spin but rooted in verifiable contradictions, then Blake Lively may be standing at the edge of a scandal that could move beyond gossip columns and into the territory of career-crippling, reputation-shattering, and possibly even legally perilous consequences, leaving fans, critics, and industry insiders to wonder aloud, has Hollywood's golden girl finally been exposed? Not as the victim of others' machinations, but as the architect of her own undoing? And if so, can even her most loyal allies save her from what comes next? The scandal swirling around Blake Lively has now reached the second phase of its crescendo, and with Bryan Freedman's latest bombshell detonating across headlines and legal chatter, Part 2 of this unfolding Hollywood saga delves deeper into the layers of manipulation, betrayal, and tactical silence that are now shaping Blake's narrative in ways she may no longer be able to control. Because while the first wave of revelations exposed inconsistencies and fractures in her carefully maintained image, this new stage reveals the anatomy of how Freedman's team allegedly built a case, so compelling that even Hollywood insiders accustomed to spin are whispering that Blake may have underestimated the magnitude of the storm. And at the center of this chapter is the question of evidence, the word that haunts every celebrity who crosses paths with Freedman, because unlike mere gossip columns, his strategies often rest on the foundation of documented communications, text messages, and transactional correspondences that can be devastating when contrasted against public statements. And sources claim that this is precisely what has now been unearthed. Emails suggesting conflicting timelines, testimonies highlighting discrepancies, and leaked fragments of conversations that undercut Blake's version of events. And suddenly the America's sweetheart, Sheen, starts to look like an elaborate mask hiding a ruthless operator. And while her defenders scramble to argue that these leaks are nothing but strategic misdirections, the weight of Freedman's involvement suggests otherwise, for he does not waste ammunition on trivial cases. And the court of public opinion is now circling around the possibility that Blake knowingly distorted narratives to secure short-term victories, unaware that long-term scrutiny would expose those distortions with brutal clarity. And this is where the "could jail be next" whispers transform from clickbait into ominous speculation, because legal scholars watching from the sidelines argue that if Blake's contradictions rise to the level of perjury or obstruction, the celebrity veneer will not shield her from potential consequences, and even if actual prison time is unlikely, the mere suggestion of it is enough to tarnish her brand, alienate her sponsors, and weaken her grip on the very Hollywood ecosystem that once celebrated her. And perhaps the most ironic layer of this scandal is that it did not need to reach this magnitude had Blake chosen a different path of humility or accountability, yet her insistence on doubling down, on framing herself as victorious in earlier stages, appears to have triggered the exact retaliation that Freedman thrives on, And nowhere is this more apparent than in the way Ryan Reynolds' behavior has shifted. Because while Blake tries to project normalcy, Ryan's solo appearance at TIFF, his deliberate avoidance of questions about Blake, and his growing reputation for aligning himself with projects and people outside of her orbit signal a calculated distancing, one that fuels speculation that he is quietly preparing to protect his own brand from the implosion of hers. And industry observers note that Ryan, ever the savvy businessman, would not risk collateral damage from Blake's scandal if he sensed the danger was merely tabloid fluff, which means his subtle withdrawal may be the clearest indication, yet that even within their marriage, fractures are widening under the pressure of Freedman's revelations. And what makes this all the more devastating for Blake is how public sympathy has shifted. Not long ago, fans rushed to defend her against accusations of manipulation, pointing to her charming interviews, her philanthropic gestures, and her friendship with Taylor Swift as evidence of her authenticity. But now those very symbols have inverted. Taylor's cold shoulder at wedding plans looks less like coincidence and more like foresight. Philanthropy looks like calculated PR cover. And witty interviews look like rehearsed lines designed to mask deeper truths. And Freedman's strategy seems perfectly attuned to this shift, because, rather than simply presenting evidence in sterile courtrooms, his team ensures that narratives leak, that timing aligns with maximum cultural impact, and that every new headline compounds the isolation Blake feels, until silence becomes complicity and complicity becomes condemnation. And as insiders describe, the psychological toll of this is immense, for Blake is not only fighting legal battles but also enduring the erosion of her support system, as colleagues hesitate to defend her brands, reconsider partnerships, and even fan accounts dedicated to celebrating her style pivot toward dissecting her scandals, leaving her stranded in a cultural no-man's land where every move she makes is scrutinized for ulterior motives. And in this void of trust, Freedman's bombshells thrive, because every contradiction they highlight feels like confirmation to an audience already primed to believe the worst. And the ripple effects extend beyond Blake herself, because Hollywood operates on alliances, and as she becomes toxic to associate with, those once tied to her orbit, Ryan, Taylor, even fellow actresses who bonded with her on sets, begin recalibrating their public stances, either through silence or through subtle shade. And this recalibration deepens her isolation, creating a feedback loop where her attempts at damage control appear increasingly desperate, while Freedman, calm and deliberate, continues to drip-feed narratives that frame her downfall not as tragedy but as inevitability. And one cannot underestimate the symbolic weight of his role in all this, because Bryan Freedman is not merely an attorney, he is a cultural force in Hollywood scandals, a man whose name alone signals that someone is about to be exposed. And now that his bombshell has shifted the narrative so decisively against Blake, the conversation has expanded beyond whether she can win in court to whether she can survive in Hollywood at all, because reputation in this industry is currency, and once it is drained, no amount of talent or charm can refill it. And in this sense, Blake's downfall, if it continues along this trajectory, will serve as a case study for how quickly the mighty can fall when legal precision meets cultural appetite for scandal. And fans who once adored her are now participating in her dissection, not with malice but with fascination, as if witnessing the unraveling of a myth is more compelling than celebrating its triumph. And the cruel irony is that Blake herself built the myth so well, so convincingly, that its destruction feels cinematic, a Hollywood drama playing out in real life, orchestrated by forces she cannot outwit, because unlike co-stars or critics, Bryan Freedman cannot be charmed, cannot be silenced, and cannot be ignored. And so as this chapter unfolds, one truth becomes undeniable. Blake Lively's battle is no longer about protecting her image, it is about salvaging whatever fragments of credibility she can before the final act of this scandal arrives, because if part 1 was the bombshell, part 2 is the slow-motion collapse, and by the time part 3 hits, the question will not be whether her reputation survives, but whether she herself has the resilience to withstand the brutal fallout of being exposed by one of Hollywood's sharpest legal minds. And in this lies the haunting drama of Blake's story. Once adored, now dismantled, her fate no longer in her own hands, but in the narratives crafted by those who hold the receipts. And Bryan Freedman, with his latest bombshell, has made it painfully clear. The receipts have only just begun to surface. As the saga barrels into its third and most devastating chapter, the story of Blake Lively versus Bryan Freedman is no longer just about legal filings or whispered betrayals. It has evolved into a full-blown morality play staged against the unforgiving spotlight of Hollywood. And what makes this part so brutal is that by now, the lines between fact, perception, and performance have blurred to the point that audiences no longer care which is which, because the narrative of downfall is far more intoxicating than the truth itself. And in this environment, Freedman's final moves land with surgical precision, designed not merely to dismantle Blake's claims, but to dismantle her identity as a cultural symbol. And sources say that his closing arguments, both in court and in the court of public opinion, lean heavily on the theme of authenticity, weaponizing the fact that Blake's brand has always thrived on the illusion of being effortlessly glamorous, effortlessly witty, and effortlessly in control. Yet behind that polished facade, the leaks, contradictions, and strategic silences reveal a woman scrambling to keep her myth intact, and when juxtaposed against Freedman's documentation, the facade collapses into something resembling manipulation, a carefully scripted fantasy masquerading as reality. And this is precisely the narrative that resonates with audiences in 2025, a time when cultural discourse revolves around exposing hypocrisy, tearing down false idols, and demanding transparency from those who once seemed untouchable. And thus Blake's silence, once her greatest strength, now operates like an admission of guilt, because in the void she leaves, others fill in the blanks, and those blanks are never flattering. And the cruel beauty of Freedman's strategy is that he doesn't even need to prove criminality to secure victory. He only needs to prove inconsistency, to highlight the gaps between her public statements and private behavior, and then sit back as those gaps are amplified into accusations of deceit, because in Hollywood, perception is punishment, and perception is precisely what Blake has lost control over. And the turning point came when whispers of potential perjury began circulating, not because prosecutors had filed charges, but because Freedman's bombshells made the possibility feel real. And in this industry, the suggestion of jail is as damning as the sentence itself, for sponsors don't wait for verdicts, colleagues don't risk their reputations, and fans don't stick around to parse legal nuance. They retreat, distance, and abandon, leaving Blake stranded in the most dangerous position a celebrity can occupy: isolation. And while her team scrambles to spin the story as a witch hunt, even they seem exhausted by the futility of trying to fight a narrative machine as relentless as Freedman's, because every attempted rebuttal sounds like noise compared to the clarity of his evidence. And in this chapter, Ryan Reynolds' role becomes all the more conspicuous because his silence, his careful avoidance of Blake's name in interviews, his growing alignment with projects that emphasize his solo identity, all point toward a man disentangling himself from a sinking ship. And while some speculate this is purely strategic, others whisper it's personal, that Ryan has long been frustrated with Blake's obsession with control, with curating every detail, with turning their marriage into a brand instead of a relationship, and now, with her downfall unfolding in real time, he no longer has the incentive, or perhaps the patience, to keep playing along. And in this sense, Blake's collapse is not just professional but deeply personal. A revelation that the partnership she once touted as a Hollywood fairy tale was, in fact, another piece of performance art, now unraveling under scrutiny. And when Taylor Swift's wedding plans excluded her, when close allies stopped publicly defending her, when brand deals began to evaporate, it all created a domino effect that left Blake exposed not only as flawed but as abandoned, a queen without a court. And in Hollywood, abandonment is the ultimate humiliation, because it signals to the public that the game is already over, that even those closest to her no longer believe in her survival. And this is where Freedman's genius becomes undeniable, because he hasn't just defeated Blake legally, he has reshaped her legacy. And instead of being remembered as the glamorous star of Gossip Girl, or the chic face of luxury campaigns, she is increasingly remembered as the actress who played too close to the fire, who underestimated her enemies, and who, in the end, was undone not by one scandal but by her inability to relinquish control. And here lies the bitter irony. Had Blake embraced vulnerability, admitted fault, or even ceded some narrative space to others, she might have weathered the storm, but by doubling down, by insisting on maintaining the facade, She gave Freedman the perfect ammunition to show that the Empress truly had no clothes. And now, as industry observers look to the future, the consensus is chillingly clear. Blake may not face literal jail bars, but she faces a career sentence of exile, relegated to the margins of an industry that once celebrated her phone calls unanswered, her pitches ignored, her brand toxic, and though Hollywood is a place of reinvention, few believe she can claw her way back from a fall this spectacular, because unlike other scandals that fade with time, this one has been documented, archived, and dissected in such detail that its shadow will follow her for decades. A cautionary tale told in backrooms and boardrooms about the dangers of underestimating Bryan Freedman. And as for him, this saga only cements his reputation as Hollywood's quiet executioner, the man whose bombshells don't just win cases but rewrite careers. And so as Part 3 concludes, the story of Blake Lively is no longer one of glamour, nor even one of scandal, but one of finality. The tale of how a woman who once seemed untouchable was brought to her knees by the one force she could never outmaneuver. The truth weaponized by an adversary who knew exactly where to strike. And while fans may debate whether she deserves sympathy or scorn, the outcome remains the same. Blake Lively, once adored, is now dismantled, her legacy rewritten not by her performances on screen but by her failures off it. And Bryan Freedman, with his final crushing moves, ensures that this is the ending the world remembers. Subscribe my channel Corevanta for more updates daily. We says to sorry because we did not upload yesterday. Thanks or watching. Subscribe my channel. Thanks. Subscribe my channel Corevanta for more updates daily. We says to sorry because we did not upload yesterday. Thanks or watching. Subscribe my channel. Thanks.